$5. That's what the small hand clutched inside a worn envelope. The Mafia Boss stared at $5 in his tattooed hands. Lunch money from a child who just hired him to make her uncle disappear. Ruby Dawson, 9 years old, stood 3 feet from the most dangerous man in Sarasota with bruises hidden under her hairline and a desperate courage that made hardened criminals look like cowards. But when Callum Vaughn opened that envelope and read her note, he realized this wasn't just a contract for murder. It was an invitation to remember what it felt like to be powerless, and what he did next would prove whether monsters could choose to protect instead of destroy. Callum Vaughn knelt on one knee before the entrance to his headquarters, his tailored dark suit immaculate. His tattooed hands visible even from a distance, intricate designs that told stories of a violent past. His slicked back hair and sharp features gave him the appearance of a predator at rest. No visible weapon, yet something in his stillness commanded absolute authority, as if danger itself recognized him as its master. Find the pressure point, and the entire structure collapses. He had told his lieutenants this countless times, a principle that built his empire from the ruins of lesser men's ambitions. Today, ironically, he was about to become someone else's pressure point. A rare moment when he'd chosen to handle a matter personally rather than delegating to his endless chain of command. A decision he would later recognize as fate. But fate had a way of arriving in the most unexpected forms. And what approached him next would test every principle he'd built his empire on. The plaza hummed with controlled activity. Men in suits spoke in low voices, conducting business that moved millions. A sleek black car idled nearby, engine purring with expensive precision. Vaughn glanced at his platinum Patek Philippe, an understated timepiece worth more than most people's annual salary, calculating how quickly he could resolve this meeting before the next crisis demanded his attention. This location had become his preferred venue for certain delicate negotiations. Not his office, not his penthouse, but here in the semi-public space where his reputation alone provided all the protection he needed, where people could see his power on full display, yet nothing illegal could be proven. Here, surrounded by the architecture of legitimate business masking his true empire, he could almost convince himself he was something other than what he'd become. He observed a young executive hurrying past, phone pressed to his ear, stress evident in every movement. The man's expensive watch and designer briefcase couldn't hide his desperation. Another soul crushed by ambition, Vaughn thought with detached interest. A world he understood intimately, but no longer felt part of. The momentary observation was interrupted by movement in his peripheral vision. A small figure in a simple green dress, hovering at the edge of the plaza with an uncertainty that didn't belong in this world of calculated confidence. What Vaughn didn't know was that this child was about to offer him something no amount of money could buy, and demand something in return that would change everything. Time seemed to crystallize as Ruby Dawson gathered every fragment of courage her small body could contain, fingers white-knuckled around her precious envelope. The $5 inside represented weeks of skipped lunches, coins hoarded, a child's entire savings offered for the impossible. Her worn shoes, a size too small, scuffed at the toes, carried her forward in halting steps across the polished stone, each one requiring more bravery than most adults possessed in their entire lives. The feared crime boss had negotiated with cartel lieutenants without flinching, had faced down federal task forces with calculated indifference. Yet something in this child's unwavering approach made his instincts sharpen in an unfamiliar way. Perhaps it was the complete absence of fear in eyes that should have shown terror, or the adult determination etched into features still soft with childhood. Whatever it was, it demanded his attention. Vaughn noticed her immediately, his awareness missing nothing even in moments of supposed focus elsewhere. Something in her purposeful stride, in the way she ignored the bodyguards and the intimidating architecture as if they didn't exist, made him pause mid-thought about the territorial dispute waiting for his decision. The girl's appearance told a story he'd seen too many times in his business. The faded cotton dress washed until the pattern barely showed, the bruise partially hidden by her hairline that spoke of an adult hand connecting with a child's skull, the eyes that held knowledge of violence no 9-year-old should carry. She stopped precisely 3 feet from where he knelt, maintaining that careful distance between proximity and intrusion. A survival instinct, he recognized. She'd learned to gauge danger. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the visible tremor in her small hands. "Are you Mr. Vaughn? Callum Vaughn?" The question hung in the air between them, reckless and precise in equal measure. Behind them, he sensed his security team tensing, hands moving toward concealed weapons, uncertain how to handle a child approaching their boss uninvited. He raised one tattooed hand slightly, a subtle gesture that froze them in place. What she said next would reveal a horror that even a man who'd seen everything wasn't prepared for. He considered lying, dismissing her with the cold silence that sent grown men scrambling for exits. Instead, curiosity overcame decades of calculated paranoia, and he tilted his head slightly. Neither confirmation nor denial, but an invitation for her to continue, despite every logical reason not to. Emma stepped closer then, closing the distance to less than 2 feet, extending both hands with the envelope held between them like an offering. Her small fingers trembled, but her voice remained steady. "I need help, sir," she stated without tears, without the dramatic pleading he'd witnessed from adults who wanted favor. "And I can pay." The absurdity of this child offering payment to a man who controlled half of Sarasota's underground economy almost broke through his carefully maintained expression. But the raw gravity in her eyes too old, too knowing, stopped any hint of amusement before it could surface. Whatever had driven her to seek him out, to cross every boundary between their worlds, to stand before the most dangerous man in the city with nothing but $5 and desperate hope, was no small matter. The contrast between them couldn't have been more absolute. His tailored suit, his tattooed hands that had ended lives, his empire built on fear and calculated violence, all of it towering over this small girl in a faded dress, clutching her life savings, asking the monster for help because she had nowhere else to turn. In the background, the bodyguards watched with trained intensity. The plaza continued its choreographed dance of power and money, and the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold that seemed too beautiful for the moment unfolding. "What kind of help?" Vaughn asked finally, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Costs $5? The question wasn't mocking. It was genuinely curious, as if her answer might contain some truth about the world he'd forgotten existed. A world where $5 could mean everything, where a child's courage could bridge the impossible gap between innocence and darkness. Her fingers tightened momentarily on the envelope before she held it out with renewed determination, her chin lifting slightly in a gesture of pride that reminded him, uncomfortably, of himself decades ago when he'd had nothing but will and desperation. "It's all I have," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "But my mom says you're fair, that you keep your word when you make a deal." And in that moment, kneeling before this child in the plaza of his empire, Callum Vaughn understood that he was about to accept a contract that would change everything. Not because of the money, not because of strategy or territory or advantage, but because sometimes, even monsters remember what it felt like to be powerless. And sometimes, that memory is enough to make them choose differently. He took the envelope. If this moment hit you the way it hit me while writing it, take a second to subscribe. It tells me you want more stories like this, and it truly helps me keep making them. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Vaughn's tattooed fingers were careful not to touch hers as he extracted the contents of the envelope. 5 crumpled dollar bills and a note written in careful, childish handwriting on lined paper torn from a school notebook. The words were simple, devastating in their directness. "Please make my uncle go away." What those 4 words meant, what they revealed about the nightmare this child was living, would push Vaughn to do something he'd never done before. He'd expected dramatics, tears, the kind of manipulative performance he'd seen from adults trying to play on sympathies he didn't possess. Instead, Emma stood there with her chin lifted, waiting for his response, as if she'd just proposed a legitimate business transaction. The bodyguards in blue jackets had moved closer now, forming a subtle perimeter, but Vaughn waved them back with another small gesture. "Why me?" he asked, his voice lower than he'd intended. "Because everyone says you're the most powerful man in Sarasota," Emma replied with a matter-of-factness that would have been amusing in any other context. "And because my mom says you're fair, that you keep your word when you make a deal." Vaughn's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't want to know what circumstances had led this child's mother to have opinions about his character. "Your mother knows who I am?" "She worked at the diner on Main Street before she got too sick." Emma's hands twisted together, the first real sign of her nervousness. "She said you always tipped the servers well, and you never made them feel scared even though everyone else did." She paused, then added in a rush, "My Uncle Wyatt says he's going to take me and Sophie away from Mom. He says she can't take care of us anymore because of her medicine making her tired. But he's lying. He just wants the checks that come for us." The pieces clicked together in Vaughn's mind with the efficiency of a man who'd built an empire on reading between lines. Sick mother, government assistance, predatory relative. A story as old as desperation itself. "Sophie's your sister?" "She's 6. She doesn't understand why Uncle Wyatt is always there now, why he makes Mom cry." Emma's voice cracked slightly, but she steadied it with visible effort. "I tried to tell the school counselor, but Uncle Wyatt said if I talk to anyone official, he'll make sure we never see Mom again. He knows people at the county office." The truth was worse than Vaughn had imagined. And what he was about to set in motion would prove that sometimes the law fails where darker justice succeeds. Of course he did. Small-time predators always knew exactly which systems to manipulate, which bureaucratic cracks to exploit. Vaughn had seen it countless times. The ones who preyed on the vulnerable always understood the machinery of suffering better than those who tried to help. He looked at the $5 in his hand, then at the child who'd saved lunch money to hire what she thought was a monster to fight another monster. The absurdity should have been laughable. Instead, it settled somewhere in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. Vaughn folded the bills carefully and reached for Emma's hand, pressing them back into her small palm and closing her fingers around them. Her hand felt impossibly fragile in his, bird bones wrapped in skin still soft enough to believe the world could be kind. "You've already paid enough," he said quietly. Emma's eyes widened, confusion and hope warring across her features. "But I need to pay you. That's how contracts work. Both people have to give something." "Consider your payment made." Vaughn pulled a phone from his inner jacket pocket, not his primary one, but a clean burner he kept for situations requiring discretion. "I need your address, your uncle's full name, and anything else you know about him, where he works, what he drives, who he associates with." As Emma recited the information in a voice that grew steadier with each detail, Vaughn typed into his phone with economical precision. The bodyguards maintained their perimeter, their faces carefully neutral, though he knew they were cataloging every word. When she finished, he met her eyes directly, letting her see the promise in his gaze. "Go home. Act normal. Don't let him know you've spoken to anyone." He paused, then added something he rarely offered. "You did the right thing coming to me, Emma. This ends now." She nodded once, her small shoulders straightening as if a weight had already begun to lift. Then she turned and walked away across the polished stone plaza, her worn shoes clicking softly, her green dress a spot of color against the expensive architecture. Vaughn watched until she disappeared around the corner, then made a call that would set wheels in motion. Some debts, he realized, couldn't be measured in currency. And some contracts, once accepted, changed everything about who you were and what you were willing to become. What Vaughn didn't know yet was that making Uncle Wyatt disappear would be the easy part. The real challenge, the one that would test him in ways he'd never been tested, was still to come. Vaughn's black Mercedes pulled away from the plaza as the evening deepened into twilight. He didn't drive toward his penthouse or any of his legitimate business fronts. Instead, he headed toward the warehouse district where questions weren't asked and answers were delivered with surgical precision. Before he'd traveled 3 blocks, he had Kellen Stone on the line. "I need everything on a Wyatt Blackwood," Vaughn said without preamble, his voice carrying the tone that meant someone's world was about to end. "Highest priority. I want his financial situation, his associations, his habits, and every piece of dirt from the past decade. And Kellen, I need it in the next 2 hours, not tomorrow." There was a pause on the other end, the kind that meant Stone was recalibrating his entire evening around this singular demand. "That's fast even for us. Should I pull Marcus off the port situation?" "Pull whoever you need. This is priority 1. Vaughn merged onto the highway, his mind already 3 steps ahead, building contingencies and backup plans. "And Kellen, when you compile this, I want to know about any children in his orbit, any complaints filed, any whispers that didn't make it to official channels." "Understood." Stone knew better than to ask questions when Vaughn used that particular tone, the one that meant someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I'll call you back within 90 minutes. What Stone was about to discover would confirm Vaughn's worst suspicions. Wyatt Blackwood wasn't just a threat. He was a predator with a pattern. Vaughn ended the call and drove through streets that grew progressively darker and more industrial, turning away from the glossy facade of legitimate Sarasota into the machinery that actually ran the city. He thought about Emma's small hand, about the careful way she'd counted out those $5 as if they could purchase salvation. In a way, they had. Just not the way she'd imagined. His phone rang exactly 83 minutes later. Stone never missed a deadline. "Wyatt Blackwood is exactly the kind of trash you'd expect," Stone began without greeting, his disgust audible even through the encrypted line. 42 years old, unemployed for the past 8 months. He's got a domestic violence charge from 6 years ago that got pleaded down, and 2 assault charges that didn't stick because witnesses recanted. His ex-wife has a restraining order that expired last year, and she moved out of state shortly after. "Financial situation?" Vaughn pulled into the private garage beneath the warehouse, the automatic door closing behind him with mechanical precision that matched his rising certainty about what needed to happen. "He's drowning. Owes $18,000 to Dimitri's operation from poker games at the underground club on Ringling Boulevard. They've been putting pressure on him for the past month. Nothing too serious yet, but it's escalating. He missed his last 2 payment deadlines." Stone paused, and Vaughn could hear papers rustling. "He's currently living off his sister's disability checks. The sister is Claire Brooks, diagnosed with MS 3 years ago. 2 daughters, ages 9 and 6. The family gets just under $2,000 a month in assistance." Vaughn's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough that his knuckles went white. "He's stealing from a sick woman and her children. Gets better. I found a CPS report from 4 months ago. Anonymous tip about the girls being neglected. Caseworker visited, noted that Wyatt Blackwood was present and claimed to be helping the family. Mother seemed scared but confirmed his story. Case was closed due to lack of evidence." Stone's voice carried the disgust he rarely showed, a crack in his professional veneer. The caseworker noted in her private file that she suspected coercion, but couldn't prove it. She wanted to follow up but got reassigned before she could. Does he have any legitimate work history? Construction, mostly. Roofing, demolition, whatever paid cash under the table. Last job was 8 months ago before he injured his back. Or claimed to, anyway. He filed for disability and got denied. Now he's trying to establish guardianship of his nieces, claiming their mother is incompetent due to her illness. He's got a hearing scheduled in 6 weeks with a judge who's known for favoring family reunification. The clock was ticking, and what Vaughn was about to orchestrate would need to happen before that hearing gave Blackwood legal power over those children. Vaughn closed his eyes briefly, the picture complete and exactly as ugly as he'd anticipated. Men like Wyatt Blackwood were parasites, consuming everything around them until nothing remained but destruction and trauma. They understood systems well enough to exploit them, but lacked the intelligence or ambition to build anything of value. They were predators of the weakest kind, those who targeted the vulnerable because they couldn't compete with anyone else. Send me everything. And Kellen? Start making inquiries about Dimitri's willingness to sell that debt. You're buying his markers? Stone's surprise was evident, a rare break in his usually unflappable demeanor. That's not usually how we operate. Tonight it is. I want Blackwood to believe he has options, that he can dig himself out. Make him desperate enough to take a risk, but not so desperate he runs. Vaughn's voice had gone cold, the tone his organization recognized as final judgment. I want him to think he's clever, that he's found a way out of his problems. Understood. I'll have the full file to you within the hour, and I'll reach out to Dimitri's people before midnight. He'll sell, he always does when the price is right, and the buyer is you. After the call ended, Vaughn sat in his car in the dim garage, listening to the buildings settle around him, the distant sounds of the city muffled by concrete and steel. He'd eliminated dozens of men over the years, each one a calculated decision based on business necessity or territorial disputes. This was different. This was personal in a way he didn't fully understand and wasn't sure he wanted to examine too closely. A child had asked him for help. A child who should have been thinking about homework and playground games had instead saved her lunch money to hire a killer. The wrongness of it sat in his chest like a weight, demanding action, demanding that he be something other than what he'd always been. But being something different meant crossing lines even he had never crossed before. And once those lines were crossed, there would be no going back. His phone buzzed with an incoming encrypted file from Stone. Vaughn opened it and began reading, committing every detail of Wyatt Blackwood's pathetic life to memory. The pattern was clear. A man who'd failed at everything legitimate, who'd turned his failures into justification for preying on those weaker than himself. A man who saw his 6 sisters' children as nothing more than sources of income, who used threats and intimidation because he lacked any other form of power. By the time Vaughn finished reading, he knew exactly how this would play out. Some men, he'd learned long ago, were beyond redemption. They consumed everything around them, leaving only destruction in their wake. The world didn't need to understand why such men disappeared. It only needed to be relieved when they did. He started the car and drove back into the night, already planning the next steps with the precision that had built his empire. Ruby Dawson had made her payment. Now it was time for Callum Vaughn to deliver on the contract. Kellen Stone stood in the corner office of Vaughn's legitimate business front, a high-end commercial real estate firm that moved enough legal money to make the illegal portions nearly invisible to outside scrutiny. Marcus Chen sat across from Vaughn's desk, his lean frame relaxed, but his eyes sharp with the focus that made him one of Vaughn's most trusted operatives. Both men had worked for Vaughn long enough to recognize when a job required delicacy rather than force. The child has seen enough trauma, Vaughn said without preamble. his fingers steepled in front of him in the gesture his people recognized as absolute focus. Whatever we do, it can't touch her or her family directly. No violence where they might witness it. No police investigations that put them under scrutiny. Nothing that adds to what they've already endured. What Vaughn was about to plan would be so precise, so carefully orchestrated, that Wyatt Blackwood would simply vanish as if he'd never existed. Marcus nodded slowly, his analytical mind already working through possibilities and discarding the obvious ones. That eliminates the straightforward approaches. If we make it look like an accident or a random crime, there's still an investigation. Questions get asked, family members get interviewed, trauma gets extended. Exactly. Vaughn stood and walked to the window overlooking the marina, watching boats sway in their slips under a sky that had cleared after the earlier humidity. Which is why we're going to make Wyatt Blackwood disappear in a way that makes perfect sense to everyone who knows him. I spoke to Dimitri's people, Stone interjected, pulling a folder from his briefcase with the efficiency of a man who anticipated his boss's needs. He's willing to sell Blackwood's debt for $15,000. A discount since he's already written off the possibility of collecting the full amount. I've got the paperwork drafted to make it look like a legitimate debt acquisition by one of our shell corporations. Vaughn turned from the window, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carrying that cold calculation his people had learned to respect. Buy it, then I want you to arrange a meeting with Blackwood. Tell him we're willing to forgive the entire debt in exchange for one night's work. A simple delivery job. High-value merchandise that requires someone unknown to law enforcement. He'll be suspicious, Marcus observed, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. Nobody forgives $18,000 for one delivery, especially not someone with our reputation. He'll be suspicious and desperate, which means he'll rationalize it. Tell him the merchandise is sensitive, that we need someone with no connections to our normal operations. Make him feel clever for being chosen, like he's finally caught a break after months of drowning. Vaughn returned to his desk, pulling up a map on his tablet with practiced efficiency. The delivery location will be the old cement factory on Industrial Boulevard, the one we acquired last year through the Riverside development deal. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Understanding. Recognition of what was really being discussed. The one with no witnesses and no cameras in a quarter-mile radius. The one scheduled for demolition in 3 months. What happened at that cement factory would ensure Wyatt Blackwood's disappearance was permanent. Literally permanent. The one that's currently pouring foundation repairs for the new development next door? Yes. Vaughn's voice remained level, businesslike, as if discussing legitimate real estate rather than murder. Blackwood arrives expecting to pick up merchandise for transport. What he finds instead is a permanent solution to his financial problems. What's the official story? Stone asked, already anticipating the need for clean narrative, for the story that would satisfy police inquiries and family questions. Wyatt Blackwood, a man drowning in gambling debts and facing multiple creditors, fled town in the middle of the night. He'd been increasingly erratic, his sister will confirm, appearing at odd hours, making strange comments about having a plan to fix everything. When he disappears, it'll be assumed he ran from his obligations. It happens every day in this city, especially with men like him who've burned every bridge and exhausted every option. The sister will be questioned, Marcus pointed out, his tactical mind running through scenarios. Standard procedure for missing persons, especially with his history. Briefly, she'll say she hadn't seen him in several days, that he'd stopped coming around as frequently after their last argument about money. She'll seem relieved more than concerned. There's already documentation of tension between them. The investigators will note that she had complaints filed against him in the past, that he was attempting to gain custody of her children against her wishes. They'll close the file as a voluntary missing person with no evidence of foul play within 2 weeks. Stone made notes on his tablet, his face impassive but his mind clearly cataloging every detail for flawless execution. Timeline? Tomorrow night. I want this done before he has another opportunity to traumatize that family, and before his custody hearing gives him any legal leverage. Vaughn's gaze was cold, final, carrying the weight of judgment that his organization had learned to respect. Kellen, you handle the debt acquisition and set up the meeting. Make it feel legitimate. Use our standard channels. Involve Dimitri's people so the story holds up under scrutiny. Marcus, you'll handle the logistics at the factory. Make it clean, make it quick, and make absolutely certain there's no connection back to the Brooks family. And the body? Marcus asked quietly, his voice carrying no judgment, only tactical necessity. The cement factory has been pouring foundation repairs for the new development next door. Dimitri's construction company is handling the work. He owes me several favors from that port situation last year, and he'll be pleased to hear Blackwood won't be defaulting on any more debts. Vaughn's expression remained neutral, professional. Concrete is remarkably permanent when properly poured, especially foundation concrete that gets inspected and signed off before the superstructure goes up. By this time tomorrow, Wyatt Blackwood would be part of the city's infrastructure, and Emma would be safe. Forever. The two men stood simultaneously, both understanding the meeting was concluded and what was expected of them. As they reached the door, Vaughn added one more instruction, his voice carrying a weight they'd rarely heard from him. Gentlemen, I want to be absolutely clear. Wyatt Blackwood is a predator who preys on the vulnerable. He's attempting to exploit a sick woman and her children for financial gain, and he's using threats and intimidation to control them. What we're doing isn't justice in any legal sense, but it is necessary. I want you both to understand that fully before you proceed. Stone turned back slightly, his expression softening in a way that revealed the man beneath the professional operator. Boss, I grew up with an uncle like Blackwood. My mother spent years afraid to leave us alone with him, years making excuses for bruises and broken promises. I have no moral qualms about this particular job. Marcus simply nodded once, his expression conveying everything that needed to be said about men who hurt children and the fate they deserved. After they left, Vaughn stood alone in his office as evening settled over Sarasota, the city transforming from business hub to nightlife destination. Somewhere across town, Ruby Dawson was probably helping her mother with dinner, trying to act normal, waiting for a miracle she'd paid $5 to purchase. She had no idea that the wheels were already in motion, that the monster she feared would be gone within 24 hours. He thought about the code he'd built his empire on. Never harm civilians, never target families, never let personal feelings compromise business decisions. What he was doing for Emma violated that last rule entirely. This was completely, undeniably personal. A child's desperate plea intersecting with something in himself he'd thought long dead. But sometimes, he decided, breaking your own rules was exactly what made you human. And sometimes, the cost of remaining human was accepting that some choices couldn't be justified, only made. Vaughn's phone buzzed at 9:47 p.m. the following evening with a text from Stone. Package has arrived at location. Everything proceeding as discussed. He was in his penthouse, standing on the balcony with a glass of scotch he hadn't actually drunk, the amber liquid catching the city lights below. Sarasota spread out beneath him like a circuit board, each light representing lives being lived, choices being made, futures being determined or destroyed. Somewhere out there, Wyatt Blackwood was walking into a building he'd never walk out of, believing himself clever enough to outmaneuver his problems. In 20 minutes, Wyatt Blackwood would realize his mistake. In an hour, he'd be gone forever. And Emma would never know the price that was paid for her safety. Another text, 15 minutes later. Delivery completed. Subject confirmed identity and location. Proceeding to final phase. Vaughn set down his glass and checked his watch. The platinum Patek Philippe that marked time with expensive precision. The cement trucks would arrive at midnight for the scheduled foundation pour, part of the legitimate construction timeline that made everything appear routine. Dimitri's crew would work through the night, experienced men who knew how to pour concrete properly and how to keep their mouths shut. No questions asked, no unusual details noted. By morning, Wyatt Blackwood would be part of the city's infrastructure, quite literally supporting the buildings where families would live and children would grow up safe. His phone rang at 11:42 p.m. Marcus's voice was calm, professional, carrying no hint of what had just transpired. Delivery completed. Brooks doesn't leave the building. Cleanup crew is finishing now. The official timetable shows concrete work beginning in 18 minutes, right on schedule. Any complications? None. Subject was cooperative until he realized the situation, then became aggressive. Stone handled it efficiently, subdued him in under 30 seconds. Total time from arrival to completion was under 8 minutes. Marcus paused, and Vaughn heard something unusual in his lieutenant's voice. Not regret, but a kind of grim satisfaction. Boss, for what it's worth, he was exactly what the reports said. His last words were threats about what he'd do to the family when he got out, how he'd make them pay for crossing him. He never stopped being a threat, not even at the end. Vaughn closed his eyes briefly, accepting the confirmation of what he'd already known. Men like Blackwood didn't change because they couldn't conceive of being wrong. Understood. Destroy all communication records related to this job. I want 0 electronic footprint. 0 trace back to any of our operations. Already done. The debt sale paperwork shows a standard acquisition by one of our shell companies. Happens dozens of times a year in this city. Blackwood's known associates will assume he ran from multiple creditors. I've already seeded rumors through Dimitri's network that he was seen at the bus station heading north, talking about starting over somewhere nobody knew his face. The family? No contact, no awareness. As far as they know, Blackwood simply stopped showing up. Stone confirmed that Blackwood called the sister yesterday afternoon, using his typical harassment tactics, demanding money, making threats about the custody hearing. That establishes his last known contact point as being consistent with his usual patterns of behavior. Good work, Marcus. Take tomorrow off. Both of you. The contract was complete, but what Vaughn didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. Emma's $5 had purchased more than her uncle's disappearance. It had purchased Vaughn's conscience. After ending the call, Vaughn remained on the balcony for another hour, watching the city sleep beneath its blanket of lights. At some point in the past 24 hours, he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He'd taken a contract from a child, executed justice outside any legal framework, and done it all for reasons that had nothing to do with profit or territory or the usual calculations that governed his world. The scotch finally found its way to his lips. It tasted like smoke and regret, and something else he couldn't quite name. Perhaps satisfaction. Perhaps the recognition that some debts required payment in forms the law couldn't provide. Some monsters needed to be removed from the world, not because it was legal or profitable, but simply because they existed and their existence caused suffering. Tomorrow, Emma would wake up and go to school, unaware that the shadow over her family had been permanently removed. She'd wait for her uncle to appear, and when he didn't, she'd feel relief mixed with fear that it was temporary. It would take her weeks to truly believe he was gone, months before the hypervigilance started to fade, maybe years before she could fully relax. But he was gone, as permanently as Vaughn could make anything gone. Reduced to component elements supporting a building foundation, his threats silenced forever. His capacity for harm eliminated with the same efficiency Vaughn brought to all his business dealings. His phone buzzed one final time. A text from Stone. Official word spreading that subject fled his debts and left town. Multiple sources confirming sightings heading north on I-75. Story is holding perfectly. Family will hear the news through natural channels by end of week. Vaughn replied with a single word. Good. Then he deleted the entire conversation thread, poured the rest of the scotch over the balcony railing in a gesture that felt oddly ceremonial, and went inside. He had legitimate business to attend to tomorrow, contracts to negotiate, territory to maintain. Life continued, as it always did, with or without Wyatt Blackwood in it. The difference was that now, somewhere in Sarasota, a little girl and her family would sleep peacefully for the first time in months. And if Callum Vaughn had to carry the weight of one more disappeared soul on his conscience, well, he'd been carrying such weights for years. What was one more ghost among the many that already haunted him, especially when that ghost had deserved its fate so thoroughly? 3 weeks after Wyatt Blackwood's disappearance, Callum Vaughn sat in his office reviewing financial reports when an unexpected impulse made him set aside the papers. He buzzed his assistant with the intercom, his voice carrying an unusual edge of urgency. But removing the threat was only step one. What Vaughn was about to discover would reveal the true scope of the family's crisis and transform him from executioner into guardian. Get me everything available on Claire Brooks. Medical records if you can access them legally, financial situation, current treatment protocols. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with. His assistant, a woman who'd learned never to question unusual requests during her 5 years working for him, simply replied, "I'll have it within the hour, sir." When the file arrived, Vaughn spent the afternoon reading through details that painted a picture of systematic medical abandonment, the kind of bureaucratic cruelty that happened every day to people who lacked the resources to fight back. Claire Brooks had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis 3 years ago, shortly after her husband had died in a construction accident that the insurance company had classified as negligence to avoid paying full benefits. The initial treatment had been standard, interferon injections that slowed the disease progression but came with brutal side effects that left her exhausted and barely functional. When her symptoms worsened 8 months ago, her neurologist had recommended a newer treatment protocol involving monoclonal antibodies, medications that had shown remarkable success in clinical trials and were now FDA approved. The insurance company had denied the request 3 times. Too experimental, they'd claimed, despite FDA approval and mounting evidence of effectiveness. Too expensive, they'd added, as if the cost of letting someone slowly lose their ability to walk and care for their children was somehow less than the cost of treatment. Claire had filed 2 appeals, both rejected with form letters that cited policy language and pre-existing condition clauses. The treatment cost $48,000 annually, a sum that might as well have been $1 million for a single mother on disability trying to raise 2 daughters alone. What Vaughn did next would prove that money, when applied with precision and purpose, could perform miracles the system refused to provide. Vaughn made 3 phone calls, each one activating networks he'd built over years of careful cultivation. The first was to a hospital administrator at Sarasota Memorial, who owed him a favor stemming from a real estate deal that had saved the hospital's expansion project from being killed by zoning issues. "I need a patient moved to the top of the list for an experimental MS treatment trial. Claire Brooks. Make it happen quietly. Make it look legitimate, and ensure she's accepted into a fully funded program. I don't care what strings you have to pull or what bureaucratic hurdles you have to navigate." The second call went to a pharmaceutical company executive whose company Vaughn had significant investments in. The kind of investments that meant his calls got answered immediately. "You're running clinical trials for an MS medication. I want one of your trial slots allocated to a patient I'm designating. Yes, I'm aware the trial is full. Make room. Consider it a favor I'll remember when the next board vote comes up for your expansion plans." The third call was to his accountant, a man who'd made his fortune making money appear and disappear through legitimate channels. "Set up an anonymous medical fund. route it through 3 different charitable foundations to obscure the source completely. I want $45,000 deposited immediately, with quarterly installments of $12,000 for the next 5 years. The beneficiary is Claire Brooks. Make it look like a grant from a patient advocacy organization. Create one if you have to. I want paperwork that would satisfy an IRS audit and a background check by a federal investigator. His accountant, accustomed to stranger requests over the years, simply asked, "Shall I prepare the usual documentation to make it audit-proof and legally bulletproof?" "Yes, and make sure it's completely untraceable to any of our operations, any of my businesses, anything that could connect back to me. This has to look like legitimate charitable work, not money laundering or influence peddling." 2 weeks later, Claire Brooks received a letter from the Southeastern MS Research Foundation, an organization that had existed for 15 years but had recently received a significant anonymous donation earmarked for expanding their clinical trial programs. The letter informed her that she'd been selected for a fully funded treatment program based on her specific disease markers and progression pattern, which made her an ideal candidate for a groundbreaking clinical trial testing new monoclonal antibody protocols. The miracle Claire had stopped believing in was about to arrive in an envelope, and her reaction would remind Vaughn why some contracts were worth breaking all his rules for. The selection, the letter explained with bureaucratic precision, was based entirely on medical criteria and her potential to contribute valuable data to the research. Everything would be covered: the experimental medication, the monitoring appointments, even transportation to the research facility for her monthly infusions. She wouldn't pay a single dollar, and if the treatment proved effective, she'd be among the first to benefit from what could be a revolutionary approach to MS management. Vaughn learned about her reaction through the surveillance he'd discreetly maintained on the family. Not invasive monitoring, but enough to ensure their safety and track the effectiveness of his interventions. Claire had called her sister in Tampa, crying so hard she could barely form coherent sentences. "They're going to give me the real medication, Sarah, not the placebo. They said my scans show I'm perfect for the treatment profile, that my progression pattern is exactly what they need for the trial data." Her voice held wonder and disbelief in equal measure, the sound of someone who'd stopped believing in miracles receiving one anyway. "After 2 years of feeling like I was drowning, like I was failing my girls, someone is actually throwing me a life preserver." Her sister, bless her practical nature, had immediately asked the right questions. "Is this legitimate? It's not some kind of scam where they want money up front or your personal information?" "I called the hospital directly. It's real, Sarah. The doctor who contacted me is head of the neurology department at Sarasota Memorial. They're starting a new trial, and they specifically need patients with my progression pattern. They even said they'll provide transportation if I need it, that they understand single mothers have scheduling challenges." Claire's voice broke again. "I thought God had forgotten about us. I thought we were going to lose everything." Vaughn closed the surveillance file and filed it away, feeling something uncomfortably close to satisfaction settling in his chest. The treatment would begin in 3 weeks. Based on the clinical data he'd reviewed, Claire would likely see significant improvement within 6 months. Her fatigue would decrease, her mobility would improve, and the terrifying progression of the disease that had been stealing her future would slow or potentially halt entirely. Money, he reflected, could solve many problems when applied with precision and discretion. The $45,000 he'd allocated was barely a rounding error in his organization's quarterly revenue, less than they spent on vehicle maintenance or telecommunications security. But to Claire Brooks, it represented hope, life, a future where she could be a mother to her daughters instead of a burden they feared losing. But Vaughn was about to discover that saving Claire's health was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The family's problems ran deeper than medical bills, and so would his interventions. He thought about Emma's $5, about her child's belief that money could purchase safety from the monsters that haunted her world. In a way, she'd been right, just not in the way she'd imagined. Her $5 hadn't bought her uncle's disappearance. That had been a gift, freely given in response to courage that had moved something in Vaughn he'd thought long dead. But they had bought his attention, his protection, his willingness to allocate resources far beyond the original contract. They had bought her family a guardian who operated from shadows, whose power could reshape their reality while remaining completely invisible. Some investments, Vaughn was learning, paid dividends that couldn't be measured in financial returns. Some contracts created obligations that transcended the original terms, becoming something larger and more meaningful than either party had anticipated. He returned to his financial reports, but the numbers seemed less important now, less urgent than they had an hour ago. Somewhere in Sarasota, a sick woman was crying tears of hope. Her daughters were sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, and a little girl who'd approached a monster with $5 had no idea that her desperate gamble was paying returns beyond anything she could have imagined. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. Over the following months, Callum Vaughn found himself checking on the Brooks family with a frequency that would have alarmed him if he'd examined it too closely. He told himself it was simple due diligence, ensuring his intervention hadn't created unintended complications or drawn unwanted attention. The truth was more complex and considerably less comfortable to acknowledge. Claire's first infusion went smoothly according to the medical reports that found their way to his desk through carefully obscured channels. By her third monthly treatment, the changes were beginning to show. She could walk to the end of the block without exhaustion dragging her down, could prepare dinner for her daughters without needing to rest halfway through, could read bedtime stories to Sophie without her vision blurring after 2 pages. By month 6, the transformation was remarkable enough that her neurologist had noted it in her file with language that bordered on astonishment. Claire had gained back 15 pounds she'd lost during her worst periods. Her gait had stabilized, and her energy levels had improved to the point where she'd started talking about returning to work part-time. Her sister reported during a phone call that Vaughn's people monitored that Claire had even mentioned taking online courses to update her nursing credentials she'd let lapse after the diagnosis. But as Claire's health improved, Vaughn realized something critical. Medical treatment meant nothing if the family remained trapped in poverty. What he did next would cross another line entirely. Vaughn arranged for that too, though with considerably more subtlety than the medical intervention. An anonymous donor, routed through 2 different charitable foundations and a community development corporation he controlled, established a scholarship program through the local community college, specifically for individuals returning to healthcare careers after medical hardship. The selection criteria were written precisely enough to ensure Claire would qualify while being broad enough that her acceptance would seem like fortunate timing rather than manipulation. But the medical treatment was only the first intervention, and Vaughn soon realized that improved health meant nothing if the family remained in a deteriorating apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots weren't uncommon and the schools were rated among the worst in the county. He'd removed one threat, but he couldn't ignore the others: poverty, unsafe housing, limited opportunities that would eventually drag them back down. He made more calls, activated more networks. A property management company he had silent ownership in through a labyrinth of shell corporations suddenly had a cancellation on a 2-bedroom apartment in a well-maintained building near Bayfront Park. The unit had been renovated recently. New appliances that actually worked, fresh paint that covered years of neglect, windows that actually sealed against the humidity and noise. The rent was listed as income-based, subsidized through a federal program that Vaughn's accountant assured him was legitimate, even if the family's qualification for it had been gently encouraged through administrative channels and strategic document management. Claire received notification that she'd been moved to the top of the waiting list due to her medical condition and family circumstances, priorities built into the federal guidelines that Vaughn's people had simply leveraged more aggressively than usual. The apartment manager, following instructions he didn't fully understand from corporate headquarters, emphasized that the family was exactly the kind of tenants we want to support, and expedited their application through approval channels that normally took months. When Claire and the girls moved in on a Saturday morning, Vaughn drove past the building once, slowly enough to see Emma carrying a box that was almost as big as she was, her face lit with a smile he'd never seen during their encounter at the plaza. The apartment's windows faced the marina, offering views of boats and water that spoke of a different kind of life than the one they'd been living. From her bedroom, Emma would be able to see the bench where she'd first stood gathering courage to approach him, though she'd never know he'd chosen this location deliberately. Each intervention was supposed to be the last, but Vaughn kept finding new ways the system had failed this family, and new ways his resources could fix what was broken. The building had security cameras that actually worked, well-lit common areas patrolled regularly, and a manager who lived on site and took his responsibilities seriously. More importantly, it was in a neighborhood where Emma and Sophie could walk to a school rated in the top tier of the district, where playgrounds weren't tagged with gang symbols, where Claire could sit on the balcony in the evening without fearing stray bullets from territorial disputes. Vaughn's accountant had looked at him with barely concealed curiosity when he'd authorized the housing expenses on top of the medical interventions. "Sir, we're now subsidizing their housing, their medical care, and you've just approved a grant for the girls' school supplies and uniforms. I'm not questioning the expenditures. You've made the priority clear. But this level of sustained support for a single civilian family is unprecedented in our operations. Note it as community investment," Vaughn had replied curtly, his tone brooking no discussion. Public relations and goodwill building? Public relations that nobody knows about? His accountant had raised an eyebrow, his professional discretion warring with genuine curiosity about his employer's motivations. Vaughn's glare had ended that conversation before it could develop further. But his accountant wasn't wrong, and Vaughn knew it even as he refused to examine his motivations too closely. The interventions had expanded beyond the original contract, make the uncle go away, in ways he hadn't anticipated. When he learned through his surveillance network that Emma needed glasses, but Claire was waiting until she could save enough money after paying for Sophie's new shoes. An optometrist who rented space in one of Vaughn's properties received a call suggesting he might want to participate in a vision charity program for underprivileged children. Emma's prescription was filled within a week, the frames carefully chosen to be nice enough to boost her confidence, but not so expensive as to raise questions. When Sophie's school sent home a notice about a field trip that cost $30, money Claire didn't have after paying for new uniforms and school supplies, an anonymous donation covered the cost for all the students whose families qualified for free lunch, making Sophie's participation seem like part of a broader charitable initiative rather than targeted assistance. Sterling told himself he was simply being thorough, that half measures created complications and vulnerabilities. If Claire's health improved but the family remained mired in poverty, the gains would be temporary. If the medical crisis was resolved, but Emma remained trapped in an underfunded school with limited opportunities, her potential would be wasted. Each intervention was logical, justified, necessary for the overall success of the operation. He absolutely refused to examine the fact that he'd started thinking about Emma's future in concrete terms, wondering if she'd go to college, what she might study, whether the fear and hypervigilance he'd seen in her eyes that day at the plaza would ever fully disappear. Refused to acknowledge that he checked the surveillance reports more frequently than any operational necessity required, that he felt something uncomfortably close to pride when her teachers noted improvements in her academic performance and social engagement. What had started as a contract was becoming something else entirely. Something Vaughn had never experienced before. Responsibility for someone other than himself. The Brooks family was thriving, and Callum Vaughn had made that happen. Not through violence or intimidation, his usual tools, but through careful application of resources and strategic manipulation of systems designed to help people, but often failing them. He'd become their invisible benefactor, their guardian angel operating from shadows, and the role felt oddly natural despite how foreign it should have been to a man who'd built his empire on fear. The Brooks family was thriving in ways that seemed miraculous to everyone who knew them. Their story taking on the quality of those feel-good news segments about families whose fortunes had inexplicably reversed. What had appeared to be an insurmountable spiral of medical debt, housing insecurity, and predatory family dynamics had somehow transformed into stability and hope. Claire was healthy, working part-time at a medical clinic while taking evening classes toward renewing her nursing license. The girls were enrolled in a good school, living in a safe apartment with views of the marina, eating regular meals, and sleeping without fear. Their caseworker from social services had closed their file with a note that read, "Family situations significantly improved through combination of medical treatment success, housing assistance program, and maternal determination. Children thriving in stable environment. No further intervention necessary." If the caseworker found it odd that so many fortunate circumstances had aligned perfectly for one struggling family, medical trial acceptance, housing upgrade, scholarship opportunities, she didn't note it in the official record. Sometimes people just got lucky. Sometimes the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. Sometimes the universe just decided to be kind. Callum Vaughn knew better. The universe had nothing to do with it. Every piece of the Brooks family's good fortune had been carefully orchestrated, funded through untraceable channels, and implemented with the same precision he brought to his more traditional business operations. The difference was that this time, success wasn't measured in territory controlled or debts collected or competitors eliminated. It was measured in a little girl's returning confidence, in a mother's renewed strength, in a 6-year-old's ability to be a carefree child instead of a casualty of adult cruelty. But the transformation happening in the Brooks family was nothing compared to what was happening inside Callum Vaughn himself. And he was about to take a step that would prove just how far he'd fallen from the man he used to be. Vaughn found himself driving past their neighborhood more often than operational security would recommend, checking on details his lieutenants could have handled remotely. He told himself it was habit, routine verification of an ongoing operation, prudent oversight of a significant resource investment. The truth sat unexamined in his chest like a weight that had somehow become comforting rather than burdensome. Emma's hypervigilance was fading slowly, her teachers reported, like ice melting under steady sun. She'd stopped flinching when people approached her desk unexpectedly, had started volunteering answers in class without the fearful calculation of whether speaking up would draw dangerous attention. She'd even joined the after-school art program, her drawings showing a gradual shift from dark, confined spaces to bright, open landscapes that spoke of internal transformation. The principal, noting this remarkable change in a student who'd been flagged for potential trauma intervention just months earlier, had recommended Emma for a scholarship program at Bayfront Academy, a prestigious private school that combined academic rigor with extensive support services. The scholarship program, which Vaughn had quietly established 3 months earlier through yet another charitable foundation, offered full tuition to 5 students annually who showed academic promise but faced financial barriers. The selection committee, carefully chosen by Vaughn's people for their genuine commitment to educational equity and their lack of curiosity about funding sources, reviewed applications with all identifying information removed to ensure unbiased evaluation. Emma's essay about wanting to study medicine to help people like her mother, written in careful handwriting that showed determination in every letter, had moved 3 of the 5 committee members to tears during the selection meeting. She was awarded the scholarship 2 weeks before her 10th birthday. The acceptance letter arrived on letterhead thick enough to convey importance, with language that made clear this was a competitive achievement based on merit, not charity offered out of pity. The program covered tuition, books, uniforms, and even a stipend for extracurricular activities and field trips. Everything necessary to ensure economic circumstances wouldn't limit her opportunities. What Claire said next, in a phone call Vaughn's surveillance captured, would reveal that she knew something was protecting her family. She just didn't know what or who. Claire had called her sister again, her voice breaking with emotion that Vaughn's surveillance captured and that he listened to alone in his office, feeling something twist in his chest that he couldn't quite name. "I don't understand how this keeps happening, Sarah. It's like someone is watching over us, making sure we're okay. First the medical trial, then the apartment, now this scholarship. It's too much to be coincidence." Her sister, ever practical but clearly moved, had replied softly, "Maybe someone is watching over you, Claire. Maybe you've got a guardian angel you don't know about. Maybe Emma's prayers got heard by someone with the power to actually help." Vaughn, listening to the recording later that evening, had felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Guardian angel. The phrase was absurd when applied to him, a man who'd sent dozens of people to early graves, who'd built an empire on violence and intimidation, who'd done things that would horrify the woman who'd unknowingly described him in such benevolent terms. He was many things, but angelic wasn't among them. Yet for this one family, in this one circumstance, perhaps he could be something other than the monster everyone feared. Not an angel. He'd never delude himself that far, never mistake tactical altruism for genuine redemption. But maybe something in between, a shadow that protected instead of threatened, a force that built instead of destroyed. A reminder that even in his world of calculated cruelty, some things could still be fixed if the right person cared enough to try. The thought should have been uncomfortable, should have triggered all his carefully constructed defenses against sentiment and weakness. Instead, it settled into place with unexpected ease, as if some part of him had been waiting for permission to be something other than what he'd always been. As if Emma's desperate courage that day in the plaza had unlocked something he'd thought permanently sealed away. Kellen Stone had noticed the change in his boss, though he'd been careful how he mentioned it during their weekly operational review. "Sir, regarding the Brooks situation, I've been tracking the expenditures as you requested. We're at just over $200,000 now when you include the medical funding, housing subsidies, scholarship establishment, and various support interventions. That's not including the initial contract fulfillment costs. $200,000 for one family. And Stone was about to learn it wasn't going to stop there." Vaughn had looked up from his desk, his expression neutral, but his eyes carrying a warning about the direction of this conversation. "Is there a problem with the accounting or the fund allocation?" "No, sir. Everything's documented correctly through the charitable channels. The paper trail is clean, the tax implications are managed properly, and there's no exposure for the organization." Stone had hesitated, then continued carefully. "It's just that this level of sustained investment in a single civilian family is unprecedented in our operations. I want to make sure there are no complications I should be aware of, no vulnerabilities we need to address." "There are no complications. The family is stable, the mother is recovering, the children are safe and thriving. Consider it a long-term investment in community relations and goodwill development." "Community relations," Stone had repeated, his tone carefully neutral, but suggesting he didn't quite believe the explanation even as he accepted it. "Understood, sir. Is there anything else?" Vaughn's voice had carried a note of dismissal. The conversation clearly concluded as far as he was concerned. Stone had paused at the door, then turned back with unusual directness. "Just one thing, boss. Whatever your reasons, what you're doing for that family, it's good. It's the kind of good that reminds people why loyalty to you means something beyond fear. The men have noticed. They don't know the details, but they know you're protecting a child who came to you for help. It matters." Vaughn had nodded once, acknowledging the observation without confirming or denying its implications. After Stone left, he'd sat alone in his office, wondering when exactly a $5 contract had turned into a decade-long commitment. Wondering when he'd stopped seeing Emma as a random desperate child and started seeing her as his responsibility, his project, his reminder that some things in this broken world could still be fixed. The realization wasn't comfortable, but he didn't push it away. Instead, he filed it alongside all the other truths he carried. One more weight in a collection that had grown so heavy over the years he barely noticed the burden anymore. One more ghost he'd thought the night Wyatt Blackwood disappeared. One more life on his conscience. But perhaps, in this one case, he could shift the weight slightly in a different direction. What happened next would prove whether redemption was possible, even for monsters. But maybe there could be something else, too. One more life saved instead of taken. One more future protected instead of destroyed. One more small piece of evidence that the scales could tip toward redemption, even if they'd never fully balance. He'd done too much, taken too many lives, made too many choices that couldn't be undone or justified. But perhaps, in this one case, he could shift the weight slightly in a different direction. Not redemption. He wasn't naive enough to believe in that anymore. But maybe something close to it. Something that let him look at himself in the mirror and see something other than the monster everyone else saw. Something that suggested the capacity for protection and building hadn't been completely destroyed by decades of violence and calculation. It was a small thing, really. One family among millions. One child saved among countless others he'd never know about or help. But sometimes, Vaughn was learning, small things were all you could save. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. It was a Saturday afternoon, 1 year and 3 months after their first meeting, when Callum Vaughn saw Ruby Dawson again. The black sedan pulled up to the curb near Bayfront Park, where Emma and Sophie were playing on the swings while Claire watched from a nearby bench, her posture stronger than it had been, her face no longer carrying the exhaustion that had defined her for years. Vaughn stepped out of the vehicle, his dark suit as impeccable as ever despite the afternoon heat, his presence immediately drawing attention even in the crowded park. Parents instinctively moved their children slightly closer. Teenagers stopped their basketball game to watch. Everyone recognized Power when they saw it, even if they didn't know his name. Emma saw him immediately. And what she was about to say would prove she'd known the truth all along. Emma saw him immediately. She stopped mid-swing, her feet dragging in the sand to slow her momentum, her eyes widening with recognition and something else. Not fear, but a kind of solemn understanding. She said something to Sophie, who continued playing obliviously, then walked toward Vaughn with steady steps that showed none of the terrified courage of their first meeting. She'd grown taller in the past year, her face had filled out with proper nutrition, and her eyes no longer carried that haunted awareness that had made her seem decades older than her actual age. The Bayfront Academy uniform, crisp white shirt and navy skirt, suited her in ways that spoke of belonging rather than costume. She looked like what she was, a child with a future. "Mr. Vaughn," she said quietly when she reached him, maintaining that same respectful distance she'd learned from hard experience. "I thought I might see you here." "Emma." He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her presence with the same gravity he'd shown that first day. "You look well. School is going well?" "Yes, sir. I'm in the advanced science program now. My teacher says I have aptitude." Pride colored her voice, the simple pleasure of achievement recognized and encouraged. "We're studying cellular biology, how diseases work and how medications target them." "Following in your mother's footsteps toward medicine?" "Maybe. Or maybe research. I want to understand how things break and how to fix them." She paused, then added with quiet intensity, "I want to help people who don't have anyone else to help them." Vaughn felt something tighten in his chest. She'd learned the lesson he'd unintentionally taught, that power meant responsibility, that some people needed protection, that the world was full of broken things that wouldn't fix themselves. He wasn't sure whether to feel proud or guilty about that education. "Your mother is doing well?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from the surveillance reports that continued to cross his desk monthly. "She's amazing. She started nursing school this semester. She says she forgot how much she loved it." Emma's smile was genuine, unguarded in a way it hadn't been before. "We have a nice apartment now. Sophie has her own room. We can see the boats from our windows. I'm glad." The words were inadequate, but Vaughn found himself at a loss for how to express what he actually felt. Satisfaction, yes, but also something warmer and more complicated. Emma looked at him directly then, her gaze holding his with a boldness that reminded him of that first desperate approach. "Why do you still help us, Mr. Vaughn? Uncle Wyatt has been gone for over a year now. You did what I asked. But the other things, my mom's treatment, our apartment, my scholarship, those weren't part of our deal." The question hung between them, cutting through pretense to the heart of something Vaughn himself didn't fully understand. And for once, he was going to tell the truth. The question hung between them, cutting through pretense to the heart of something Vaughn himself didn't fully understand. He could lie, dismiss her with some easy explanation about community investment or strategic philanthropy. But she deserved better than lies. She'd trusted him with her $5, and her desperate plea had shown more courage than most adults he knew. She deserved at least a portion of the truth. "Because watching your family heal reminds me that some things can be fixed," he said finally, his voice carrying an honesty that surprised even himself. "In my world, Emma, most things stay broken. Most problems don't have solutions, only management strategies and acceptable losses. But you, your family, you're proof that sometimes, if the right resources get applied at the right time, broken things can become whole again." Emma considered this, her young face serious with thought. "My mom says we have a guardian angel watching over us. She doesn't know who, but she lights candles at church every Sunday and prays for whoever is helping us." "Your mother should keep believing in angels," Vaughn replied quietly. "They're more comforting than the truth usually is." "I know it's you," Emma said simply, without accusation or dramatic revelation, just stating a fact she'd apparently known for some time. "I don't know how you do it all, or why you keep doing it, but I know it's you. The timing is too perfect. Everything that helps us happens right when we need it most." Vaughn didn't confirm or deny, simply held her gaze. "If you're right, and I'm not saying you are, what would you do with that information?" "Thank you," she said immediately. "And promise that when I'm older, when I'm a doctor or a scientist, I'll do the same thing for other people. I'll be someone's guardian angel, even if they never know my name." Something in Vaughn's carefully constructed walls cracked at that moment. This child had somehow managed to do what federal investigators, rival organizations, and his own conscience had failed to accomplish: make him feel genuinely, uncomfortably human. Something in Vaughn's carefully constructed walls cracked at that moment. Something he'd spent decades building to protect himself from exactly this kind of sentiment. This child who'd approached him with $5 had somehow managed to do what federal investigators, rival organizations, and his own conscience had failed to accomplish: make him feel genuinely, uncomfortably human. "I'll watch over you and your family until it's no longer necessary," he said finally, making a promise he rarely made to anyone. "You focus on school, on becoming the person you want to be. Let me handle the rest." "How long is until it's no longer necessary?" Emma asked, her practical nature reasserting itself. "Until you're old enough and established enough to protect yourselves. Until your mother is stable in her career. Until Sophie graduates high school. Until I'm confident that removing my protection won't leave you vulnerable." He paused, then added, "Probably longer than that, if I'm being honest. I don't seem to be very good at walking away from this particular investment." Emma smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face into something genuinely childlike. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. For everything. For making Uncle Wyatt go away. For helping my mom get better. For making sure we're safe. I know what you are. What people say you are. But to us, you're something different." "What am I to you, Emma?" Vaughn asked, genuinely curious about how this child had categorized him in her understanding of the world. "You're the man who keeps his promises," she said simply. "You're the person who helps when nobody else will. You're proof that even scary people can do good things when they choose to." Before Vaughn could respond, Sophie called Emma's name from the swings, her child's voice piercing through the weight of the moment. Emma glanced back at her sister, then looked at Vaughn one more time. "I should go. Mom gets worried if we're out of her sight too long. Old habits." She started to turn, then paused. "Will I see you again?" "Probably not directly. I tend to work better from a distance." Vaughn's expression softened slightly, almost imperceptibly. "But I'll be watching. You'll be safe, Emma. All of you. That's a promise." She nodded once, then ran back to her sister, her ponytail bouncing, her laughter carrying across the park as she pushed Sophie on the swing. Vaughn watched for a moment longer, then returned to his car where Kellen Stone waited behind the wheel. "Everything all right, boss?" Stone asked as they pulled away from the curb. "Everything's fine," Vaughn replied, watching the Brooks family recede in the side mirror until they disappeared into the ordinary afternoon crowd. "Better than fine, actually. Everything is exactly as it should be." 6 months later, on a Wednesday afternoon that felt significant in ways Vaughn couldn't quite articulate, 2 letters arrived through separate channels that seemed cosmically coordinated. The first was a notification from the University of South Florida's nursing program. Claire Brooks had been accepted into their accelerated nursing degree program with a full scholarship designated for healthcare workers returning to the field after medical hardship. A scholarship Vaughn had funded through his usual labyrinth of charitable foundations. The second letter was addressed to Ruby Dawson from Bayfront Academy's admissions office. She'd been accepted into their prestigious middle school program with continued scholarship support, plus an invitation to their advanced STEM track that would put her years ahead of standard curriculum. But Vaughn wasn't finished. What he was about to do would ensure Emma's future for decades to come, long after he was gone. Vaughn read both notifications, obtained through the discreet monitoring system he maintained, and felt satisfaction settle into his bones. The pieces were falling into place. Claire would have her career back, would be able to support her family independently within a few years. Emma would receive the education she deserved, would have opportunities that her earlier circumstances would have made impossible. Sophie was thriving in elementary school, her early trauma fading into vague memory rather than defining characteristic. He called his accountant one final time. "Set up a trust fund. Beneficiary is Ruby Dawson to be activated on her 18th birthday. I want enough for a full 4-year degree at any state university, with additional funds for graduate school if she chooses that path. Medical school isn't cheap." "Sir, we're already covering her primary and secondary education through the scholarship program, plus the various family support initiatives. This would be—" "I know what it would be. Do it anyway." Vaughn's voice carried finality. "And include provisions for Sophie as well. Same terms, same timeline. Both girls get the opportunity to become whoever they want to be, regardless of cost." "Understood. I'll have the paperwork drafted by end of week." His accountant paused, then added carefully, "This is remarkably generous, sir. These girls will have more opportunity than 99% of children in this country." "That's the point," Vaughn replied simply. "One child asked me for help with $5 and more courage than most adults possess. This is me making sure that courage pays dividends for the rest of her life." After ending the call, Vaughn allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He was a criminal. He'd built his empire through violence, intimidation, and calculated cruelty. He'd ended lives, destroyed rivals, made decisions that haunted him in the quiet hours before dawn when even scotch couldn't silence the ghosts. But he'd also saved Ruby Dawson and her family. He'd transformed their trajectory from inevitable tragedy to genuine hope. He'd proven, to himself if no one else, that even monsters could choose to protect instead of destroy, to build instead of break, to be something other than what everyone feared. It wasn't redemption. The scales would never balance. But it was something. And sometimes, that something was everything. It wasn't redemption. The scales would never balance. But it was something. And for a man who'd spent his life dealing in darkness, that small light, reflected in the future of a little girl who'd approached him with $5 and desperate hope, was more than he'd ever thought he deserved. More than he'd ever thought possible. But exactly what he'd needed without knowing he needed it. The machine of his empire continued turning, dealing in territories and conflicts and all the usual business of organized crime. But somewhere in Sarasota, a family slept peacefully because Callum Vaughn had chosen, just once, just for them, to be something other than the monster everyone expected. Some things, indeed, could be fixed. Not everything. Not even most things. But sometimes, if you cared enough and acted decisively enough and allocated your resources with precision and purpose, you could take one small piece of a broken world and make it whole again. And sometimes, against all odds and logic and the weight of your own dark history, that was enough. That was everything. If this story touched your heart, please share in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that help sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Your support keeps these stories alive.